Billionaire was about to leave, until the waitress handed him an old photograph. What if one crumpled photograph could change everything you thought you knew about your past? Richard Ashford had built an empire worth $3 billion, but tonight, sitting alone in Murphy's diner at 11:30, he felt emptier than he'd ever been. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he pushed scrambled eggs around his plate, his phone buzzing with another urgent business call he chose to ignore. This wasn't the life his mother had dreamed for him when she tucked him into bed each night, whispering stories about kindness and following your heart. Outside, rain tapped against the windows like fingers trying to get his attention. He was about to signal for his check and disappear back into his lonely penthouse when something extraordinary happened. The waitress, a woman with gentle eyes and weathered hands, approached his table with more than just his bill. She carried with her a piece of his forgotten past that would shatter everything he believed about himself. "Where are you watching from tonight?" The waitress moved with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent decades caring for others. Her name tag read, Betty, and though she looked to be in her 70s, there was something timeless about the way she carried herself. Richard had stumbled into Murphy's diner after his driver got lost in the older part of town, far from the gleaming skyscrapers where he usually conducted his ruthless business deals. He'd been returning from his mother's grave, a monthly ritual he performed alone, always wondering if he'd made her proud or disappointed her beyond measure. Murphy's diner hadn't been renovated since the 1960s, with its red vinyl booths and black and white checkered floor. The coffee was strong, the pie was homemade, and the customers were mostly night shift workers grabbing a bite before heading home to their families. Richard felt completely out of place in his $1,000 suit, but something about the warm lighting and the smell of fresh bread made him want to stay. Betty had been watching him carefully all evening, noting how he ate mechanically, how his shoulders seemed to carry the weight of the world, how he never once looked up from his plate except to stare out at the rain. She'd seen plenty of lost souls come through those doors over the years, but this man seemed different. There was something familiar about his face, something that tugged at memories she thought she'd buried long ago. "More coffee, honey?" she asked, approaching his table with the pot already in hand. Her voice had that gentle southern drawl that reminded Richard of his childhood, though he couldn't quite place why. "Please," he said, finally looking up to meet her eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Betty's hand trembled slightly as she poured, and Richard noticed a small scar on her wrist that seemed oddly familiar. "You remind me of someone," Betty said softly, setting the pot down on the table. "Someone I knew a very long time ago." Richard's chest tightened. He'd heard those words before, from strangers who recognized him from magazine covers or news reports. But this felt different. This felt personal. "I get that a lot," he replied, though his voice betrayed his curiosity. "I have one of those faces, I guess." Betty smiled, but it was tinged with something that looked like sadness. "No, honey. This is different. Would you mind if I sat down for just a moment? There's something I think you need to see." Richard gestured to the empty seat across from him, his business instincts warring with an inexplicable pull toward this stranger. Betty settled into the booth with a slight wince, her arthritis acting up from the long shift. She reached into her apron pocket and withdrew something wrapped in a faded cloth napkin. 43 years, she said quietly, unwrapping the small bundle with reverent care. "I've been carrying this around for 43 years, wondering if I'd ever find the right person to give it to." Inside the napkin was a photograph, creased and yellowed with age. The image showed a young woman with kind eyes holding a baby boy, both of them standing in front of a small house with peeling paint and a garden full of sunflowers. Richard's breath caught in his throat. The woman in the photograph was his mother, but she looked younger than he'd ever seen her, and happier somehow. The baby in her arms wore a tiny blue sweater he'd never seen before. "Where did you get this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the diner's refrigerator. Betty's eyes filled with tears. "Your mama gave it to me the night she brought you to my house. You were just 18 months old, crying something fierce because you missed her already. She said she had to give you a better life, one she couldn't provide working 3 jobs just to keep food on the table." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. His entire life story, everything he thought he knew about his origins began to crumble around him. He'd been told his mother was a single woman who'd raised him alone until she could afford a better neighborhood when he was 3. He had no memory of any time before their modest apartment on Elm Street. "That's impossible," he said, though his hands were shaking as he held the photograph. "My mother never mentioned. She made me promise never to tell," Betty continued, her voice thick with emotion. "But when you walked in here tonight, I knew. You have her eyes, and you have the same way of holding your shoulders when you're carrying too much weight. I took care of you for almost 2 years while she worked herself nearly to death, saving every penny so she could take you back and give you the life you deserved. If this moment has touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up." Richard stared at the photograph, and suddenly he could smell sunflowers and remember hands that weren't quite his mother's but had loved him just the same. But if Betty had cared for him, why had his mother never mentioned her? What else had been hidden from him all these years? Richard's carefully constructed world was collapsing with each word Betty spoke. He'd built his fortune on the belief that he'd overcome a difficult childhood through sheer determination and his mother's unwavering support. But now, learning that there had been another mother figure in his life, someone who'd loved him and then disappeared without explanation, left him feeling utterly lost. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why didn't she ever tell me about you? Why didn't she bring me back to visit?" Betty wiped her eyes with a corner of her apron. "Pride. Honey. Your mama was so proud, and so scared. She was barely 19 when she had you, and her family had disowned her. She worked as a cleaning lady during the day and waitressed at night, sleeping maybe 4 hours if she was lucky. When she finally saved enough to rent that apartment and take you back, she was terrified you'd love me more than her." The pain in Richard's chest was almost unbearable. He thought about all the times his mother had seemed sad when he asked about extended family, how she'd always changed the subject when he wondered about his early years. She'd been protecting herself from the fear that she wasn't enough, that the woman who'd actually raised him during those crucial first years had a stronger claim to his love. "She used to cry every night when she'd call to check on you," Betty continued. "I'd tell her how smart you were getting, how you'd learned to walk and then to say your first words. But instead of being happy, she'd just cry harder, convinced she was missing all the important moments." Richard closed his eyes, imagining his teenage mother working herself to exhaustion, sacrificing everything including precious time with her son to build a better future for him. The guilt he felt was overwhelming. All these years, he'd judged her for being distant sometimes, for working too much even when his businesses started bringing in money. He'd never understood that she'd already sacrificed the most important years of motherhood for his sake. "I tried to stay in touch after she took you back," Betty said softly. "But she asked me to let you both move on. She said it would be easier for you to bond with her if you didn't remember me. Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments." Richard looked down at his hands, the same hands that had signed billion-dollar deals and fired hundreds of employees without a second thought. Tonight, they felt like the hands of that 18-month-old boy who'd been loved by 2 women willing to break their own hearts for his happiness. But there was something else Betty wasn't telling him, something he could see in her eyes. What other secrets had his mother kept to protect him? "There's more, isn't there?" Richard asked, studying Betty's face. "Something else you haven't told me." Betty nodded slowly, reaching into her pocket again. This time, she pulled out a small wooden box, no bigger than her palm. "Your mama left this with me the night she took you back. She said if anything ever happened to her, and if you ever found your way to me, I should give it to you." Richard's mother had passed away 5 years earlier from cancer, a battle she'd fought with the same quiet strength she'd shown throughout his childhood. They'd grown closer in her final months, but even then, she'd never mentioned Betty or the early years of his life. Inside the box were 3 items: a folded letter in his mother's handwriting, a small silver locket, and a savings account passbook from a bank that had closed decades ago. The letter was dated just 2 months before her death. "My dearest Richard," he read aloud, his voice trembling. "If you're reading this, then you found Betty, and she's decided it's time you knew the truth. I've regretted keeping her from your life every single day for 40 years. Betty Walsh didn't just watch you for 2 years, she saved both of our lives. The letter went on to explain how Betty had taken them in when they had nowhere else to go, how she'd worked extra shifts to help his mother save money faster, how she'd sung him to sleep when his mother worked nights. But most importantly, it revealed that Betty had refused any payment for her care, despite being a single mother herself, working to support her own young daughter. Richard looked up at Betty with new understanding. You had your own child to care for, but you took us in anyway. My Hannah was 3 at the time, Betty said softly. Having you there made her so happy. You two were like brother and sister. She cried for weeks after you left. The locket contained a picture of Richard and Hannah as toddlers, playing in that same sunflower garden. Looking at it, memories began flooding back. Not clear images, but feelings, scents, the sensation of being completely loved and safe. Richard opened the savings account book and gasped. The account contained nearly $50,000, an enormous sum for a young woman in the 1980s. A note attached explained that his mother had continued making deposits every month for years, hoping to repay Betty someday for her kindness. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. As Richard stared at the evidence of his mother's love and Betty's sacrifice, he realized his entire understanding of family, generosity, and love had been transformed in a single evening. But one question remained: where was Hannah now, and could he find the sister he'd lost but never forgotten? The dawn was breaking outside Murphy's diner as Richard sat in stunned silence, holding the pieces of his past. Betty had called her daughter, and within an hour, Hannah arrived, a successful teacher with her mother's kind eyes and a smile that triggered buried memories in Richard's heart. The reunion was like finding a missing piece of himself he'd never even known was lost. Hannah remembered him clearly, how they'd shared toys and fallen asleep holding hands during naptime, how he'd cried when his mother came to take him away. She'd asked about her little brother for years before finally accepting that he was gone forever. They spent the morning sharing stories, filling in the gaps of each other's lives, marveling at how they'd both ended up successful but never quite feeling complete. Richard looked around the diner where this miracle had unfolded and made a decision that would have shocked his business partners. He offered to buy the diner from the elderly owner who'd been struggling to keep it open, not to demolish it for a development project, but to ensure it remained exactly as it was, a place where lost souls could find their way home. Betty laughed through her tears when he asked if she'd consider staying on as manager, saying she couldn't imagine working anywhere else. But the most profound change came in how Richard understood his mother's love. The woman he'd sometimes seen as distant and overly focused on work had actually been the most selfless person he'd ever known. She'd given up precious time with her baby, endured the heartbreak of watching another woman raise him during his first steps and words, all to ensure he'd have opportunities she couldn't provide. Every business success, every comfortable moment of his childhood, had been built on her quiet sacrifices and Betty's generous heart. 3 months later, Richard had moved his primary residence to a modest home just blocks from the diner, close enough to have breakfast with Betty and dinner with Hannah several times a week. He'd restructured his business empire to focus on charitable foundations, particularly those supporting single mothers and child care assistants. The photograph that had started it all sat framed on his desk, a daily reminder that love often wears the disguise of difficult decisions and that family can be found in the most unexpected places. Murphy's Diner became more than a restaurant. It transformed into a community center where Richard funded job training programs, and Betty's wisdom helped guide young mothers facing impossible choices. The sunflower garden behind the building bloomed every summer, tended by Richard and Hannah together, honoring the memory of a young woman who'd loved them both enough to make the hardest decision of her life. On quiet evenings, Richard would sit in the same booth where his life had changed forever, watching Betty serve coffee to night shift workers and knowing that sometimes the greatest wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the love that shapes us when we're too young to remember, yet old enough to be changed forever. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery, love, and the beautiful truth that family is often larger and more loving than we ever dared to imagine.